Hello! Welcome to Hope Unabridged. I'm Casey Brennan.
I'm Angie Elkins.
And we're so excited for you to be here today. And also, we have a really great guest. We have Chuck DeGroat on today, who is a follower of Jesus, a husband to Sarah for 26 years, father to 2 amazing daughters, professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. And he wrote his first book at 40, which I think is so awesome and gives me so much hope for my life. He's a licensed therapist and a spiritual director and speaker that leads retreats. And we're so excited to talk to him today about narcissism in the church, which is kind of a hot topic right now. We've heard a lot about it in the last 2 years, just the word narcissism. And so we're going to talk about narcissistic leaders, how that shows up.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I've grown up in the church, as have you. And if you've grown up in your church and been super involved, you've probably encountered a narcissistic leader at some point, which is so interesting. But you know, the church is just like any other organization. We're all broken. And so we're going to have broken people involved. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say about how we deal with it in the church, because we always want to deal with things in a Christ-like way. We want to handle them with the most grace and compassion that we have. But it's very, very hard when you see what can sometimes be called trauma or even abuse in certain situations going on in your church.
Totally. And we look at church as a safe place, right? Like that's like our family, that's our safe spot. A lot of people that have been broken or in trauma come to the church to find that family and safe space. And so this was so interesting to me, this book, because it breaks down how narcissism shows up in the church. And it's something that we don't go into a church thinking we're going to find. Like I didn't. I don't.
Exactly.
You know, you think of it as, like I said, a safe space, but also like a very humble, humility-filled, you know, God-inspired place.
I think we all have kind of a certain expectation or standard for our pastors or our leaders in our church. And so we almost forgive them immediately in a way because we think, and when I say forgive, I don't necessarily mean that. I mean, let it go, dismiss. Because we think, well, on the outside it may look like that, but behind the scenes I'm sure they're very humble. I'm sure they're very grace-filled. And when you get more and more involved, sometimes you find out that's not true. And so it's hard. It's hard to know how to deal with it and how to get out from under it, you know, not just in the church, but in personal relationships. You know, there are marriages where there is a narcissistic partner and it's hard to get out of. And so it's a much needed conversation.
It is. What was one of the takeaways that you had after reading it?
After reading it, probably just the affirmation validation of my experience. I've been through several situations where I feel like I've been through, maybe not with a full-blown narcissist, but with someone who had that type of behavior. It even gave me sort of insight, I would say, to recognizing it in myself to a degree.
Like I mean, we're all capable of it, for sure.
I mean, this is one of those topics that we would love to just point our finger outward.
I know,
But I think if we want to grow and be more like Christ, we have to point our finger inward and say, do I have these tendencies? You know, I am kind of an aggressive type personality, and I tend to just kind of move through life doing my thing and not be too affected by what people input from other people. And so I could see how if I don't keep a check on it, I could have that. I could lean toward that behavior, you know?
And I think we all can. It's a real thing. I mean, I miss things all the time. And I love it when people will come forward, though, and tell me, like, hey, you hurt my feelings over here. I love that. Because I probably didn't even recognize that I did that. And so for me to have that, like, you come tell me that just means the world. And I'm like, great, I need to work on that. And I know what I need to work on. But
you know, it's funny that you say that. That reminds me of a conversation I had once with a Disney employee. So funny. But she was telling me a story about just, you know, a person coming to the parks and having a bad experience, whatever. And I asked her, would you rather that person leave without telling you and just keep it to yourself? And she said, no, I would much rather know so that I can make it right.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, that's just great.
That's a healthy person.
Way to live life, right?
It is.
Because if someone comes to you and said, hey, this is how I'm experiencing you,
right.
That's a gift.
Mm-hmm.
That's a gift. And to be able to receive that without being defensive.
That shows a lot of growth.
What about you? What were your big takeaways from his book?
Gosh, I mean, the whole thing.
The whole thing.
Literally. There's a question that I do want to ask, though, is transparency the way forward to healing? That was something that really stood out to me, and just being transparent, like you said, with our own, like looking inward, but then also I just would love to hear transparency from leaders in my life and people in my life. Like, just, cut all the stuff and give me the broken.
Real.
Yeah.
Oh, the broken. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. But I'm really excited to have this conversation with Chuck, and I know that you guys will love it. Yeah. So without further ado, welcome back, Chuck.
Hello, you guys. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here. We have a lot we want to talk to you about today.
So much. My husband and I devoured your book, and it was so good and so eye-opening. And is transparency, is that the way forward towards healing? Like, I feel like if church leaders would just stand up on on Sunday and just be transparent about brokenness, I would have so much more respect.
Yeah, that's such a big word. That's such an important word. I think, transparency, honesty, vulnerability, the kinds of things. Brene Brown has been a teacher to many of us over the last 10 or 12 years around these things, the way we show up with that kind of fundamental. I wrote a book called Wholeheartedness, a kind of integrity of heart, where the inside matches the outside. And I think that that's so important. I think the transparency doesn't mean, by the way, being like that a pastor has to share everything that's going on in her heart from the platform every Sunday morning, every confession of sin. Yeah. It does mean that we have people in our lives who are honest with, that we have a staff team where we can be vulnerable to some degree with and know and be known. And that's tough when you have a narcissistic leader who's so well defended, so psychologically defended. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder, I tend to be more of an assertive personality. And, sometimes when people offer opinions to me, it doesn't really matter to me as much. I tend to be more, whatever. How do I guard myself against narcissism?
Yeah, that's such an honest question and curious question. And maybe just asking the question is the first step, right? Mm-hmm. I had a bunch of really anxious pastors reach out to me after the book came out and ask the question, am I a narcissist, right? And I think I'd inevitably say something like, I think if you're asking that question, that's a good place to start. Now, I realized along the way also that in a couple of those situations that they were asking that question as a kind of preventative measure. So there are, as I was saying earlier, there are these narcissistic leaders who like to use this and say, not only say that I have all the psychological tests and assessments and counseling, but look, I have on my desk Chuck DeGroat's book so that I'll never become like that, okay. And so that can be tricky. I'll say this briefly. I don't want to go too long, and we could flesh it out if you want to, but I often talk about the importance of story, awareness, and relationship. Getting to know your story and connecting the dots of your story. Awareness, what we call now emotional intelligence, that's self-awareness, that's empathy, that's understanding how you impact others and some other things. And then relationship, like who do you have in your life who really knows you? And do you have the kinds of honest relationships where you know and can be known? And oftentimes with narcissistic leaders who have big falls or adultery or even take their lives or whatever it might be, we find that, wow, he had a lot of friends, but no, he was never really known. Mm. And that's sad.
That is sad. Very sad.
What does a healthy church look like? Like, you've sat in a lot of churches and, you've counseled a lot.
Not a perfect church.
No, but a
healthy church.
What does it look like?
Yeah. Well, so I do some work at some other it much better than me in and around family systems and healthy family systems. Oftentimes when I talk about these things, I begin with the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit creating the world. Father, Son, and Spirit not in competition with one another, not like, I want this role and I get this job and but in interdependent relationship, not independent, not codependent, but self-giving love, giving and receiving, and that we're made in the image of a Trinitarian God. And our relationships image what I call a Trinitarian dance. And when we're at our best, we're living in that Trinitarian dance, which means that we're in relationships where we can be defined and connected. You can have your thought about something, and I can have my thought about it, and we might be on different pages on some things, but we can remain connected, and we welcome one another's whole voice and whole person in that relationship, which is, by the way, something a narcissistic leader can't do. Always looking to sort of minimize the other to escalate or amplify themselves. And so it's a kind of church environment where we can be in relationship with one another, but not in slimy or sticky ways, right? Where we're codependent with one another, but where there's a basic honesty, and where we love one another, not from a place of I give to get, but from a desire to bless another. And the tricky thing about that, to use that word again, is I remember, the late Larry Crabb. Larry Crabb just died a few days ago. Larry had a huge influence on so many of us. Yeah. Larry wrote a book called The Safest Place on Earth a long time ago as a kind of vision of a healthy church. And then I remember him coming to Orlando, where I was doing some adjunct teaching at the seminary at the time. And he said, well, wow, that wasn't what it was cracked up to be. He said, I left the clinical world to go into the church, and I tried to do it, and I realized, wow, we sabotage and self-destruct, and even the best people, the nicest people, the godliest people do it too. And churches, we can aspire towards safety and health, but we stumble over ourselves quite a bit. And so I think that leads to us not giving up, but having a lot of compassion for one another, grace. Even in the healthiest systems, you're going to stumble, you're going to hurt one another. One of the things that I do, even for my students now that I'm a seminary professor, I was a pastor for a long time, and I asked the question, I still ask the question, how do you experience me? And I'll say to my students early on, you're going to experience things from me that are hurtful. You'll experience me as arrogant or dismissive or whatever it is. And they'll always say, no, you can't be that way, because you write books about psychology and health. And inevitably, like, I'll get a knock on the door, and one of them will come up to my office and say, hey, the other day, recently you've been walking, as I heard 6 months ago, you walk back and forth in the atrium, and I try to get your attention, but you seem so busy and preoccupied. And then you go up to your office upstairs, and it seems like you're just too important for conversations with me. Ouch. Yeah. And so then I have to say, okay, tell me more about that. And I think in healthy spaces, we acknowledge that we're going to stumble, we're going to hurt one another, that we're not always going to show up perfectly and healthily. And that's the way it is. And I don't know if you're married, but in marriages, that's the way it is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So is there hope for a narcissist to change? Because when I think of a narcissist, I just think of the most difficult, protected, walled off person who absolutely cannot change.
Yeah.
So have you ever seen a narcissist break and turn?
Yeah. Well, should I say it again? That's a tricky question. Yeah. Well, so here again, when we use the language of narcissist, I could say, yes, I have seen narcissists change. I rarely see people with narcissistic personality disorder change in significant ways. And that might be the difference. Someone on the narcissistic spectrum, where there is some of that grandiosity, bullying, and arrogance, and perhaps he or she is willing to hear and engage some work. Yeah. Someone with narcissistic personality disorder and pretty escalated on that spectrum, it's harder and it takes a long while. And I'll give you just a real quick example. About 12 or 13 years ago, there was a pastor who was diagnosably narcissistic personality disorder who was caught in an affair and exposed and had to step down from church and ministry and wanted to get back right away. Like this is what we often see is I need to get back on the stage because that's the only place where I exist is on stage. And he tried and tried, and we were able to stay connected to him enough for him to eventually say, well, I guess I'm not going to get my way back on stage, so I'll become, let's just say, a realtor because I want to fuzzy up the details. Yeah. And so we kept in touch, and he began doing work in his marriage, and then a few years later was fully invested in doing real estate, and then a few years later we were able to catch up, and things were going better in his marriage. And a few years later, he called maybe 8 or 9 years later, says, I think I'm ready to get back in. And I do the whole, oh no, inside, right? Yeah. And he said, oh no, not like that. I was thinking of maybe just volunteering. Like maybe I can just volunteer to clean the bathrooms to start.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, there you go. Okay. That's a difference. Now that, I think he was probably pretty escalated on the narcissistic spectrum, right? I never did the official testing of him, but he was way up there. And we saw this incremental change. And I saw that as he's still not in ministry, but he's, I'll just say he's volunteering for a church in a very limited way. And I think there's some humility there. And if in 10 years, maybe he's ready to come on as an associate pastor and follow it, who knows? But that's the kind of incremental change. And it happened in his closest relationships first. It wasn't about getting the platform back. It was about, I've got a long and hard work in my marriage, even to get to a place of minimal trust. And so, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for giving us kind of a picture of that too, because it's hard to imagine it happening, Yeah. So that's really good.
It is. I have another tricky one. I know. I'm sorry. I'm curious though, because, we hear like if you come from a privileged family, and it's kind of like it's generational, right? Do you sometimes see that in those families where it's like, the generation above is trying to protect the narcissist generation here, and it gets complicated?
Yes. Yeah. The short answer is yes. It is complicated, and there can be a kind of generational or even collective narcissism within families. In the Smith family, we never fail. We always, the Smith boys are always captains of the football team, and we're always, stars in the community theater, and we always have the nice house in the end of the cul-de-sac, and whatever it is, There was just a major interview we're recording this a couple of days after a major interview with Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
And I think they were talking about dynamics of a system where there's a kind of privilege, perhaps some abuse or narcissism. I mean, I heard enough to say when you feel like you're trapped in a system where you can't even sound the alarm that you're suicidal, that there's something, you're in pain. That seems to be a generational kind of thing. We see this within family systems. We see this within church systems. We see this when there are generational successions of grandfather, father, son in churches. We see this, but we also see this, in kind of white male settings, patriarchal settings where, I have seen in certain settings where women are invited to be ordained, and I don't know where you all are on this, but I'll just give you a quick example where even there, only the men get to go out at night and drink bourbon and smoke cigars and make the decisions for the church, right? And so even in a more egalitarian setting, it's sort of like there's still this culture of the men get to be the decision makers. And so we see this in subtle and not so subtle ways in all kinds of systems. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I want to ask you again about family, because I know in churches, they're just sort of like family business in a way that, the kids grow up and maybe want to go into church ministry because the parents did it, right?
Yeah.
So if we've had a bad experience, let's say, with a family in a church, do we make a hard and fast rule, no more families can serve in this church? No more husbands, wives, no more, or do we take those case by case? I mean, I feel like there can be a knee-jerk reaction when we've been hurt by this group,
Right.
if it's,
Right.
Women, let's say, women tend to be too outspoken or whatever. So no more women, or,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is that sort of knee-jerk reaction, and in part because we want to scapegoat a person or a group. We sort of want to blame it on the, if only we didn't have that women's ministry where they're always getting together and talking about the decisions we're making here.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have problems if we didn't have them, having tea at 10:30 every Tuesday morning and talking about how we should be doing our job. And, it's kind of disgusting to say that out loud, but that happens. And we want to scapegoat whole groups or families or people within the church, particular staff members. I was just doing some work with a larger church where a couple of staff members were whistleblowers in a really abusive system. And it was sort of like, they're the problems. And if we got them out of here, then we would have a healthy church. And so that's always a tendency.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's sad too. Oh,
Yeah.
breaks my heart.
Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. And I want to talk, I could talk to you for an hour longer, but we don't have the time. I wish we did. But how can people contact you? Because I know that you also video series. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that'd be really helpful for people. Yeah,
I've got a website, chuckdegroat.net, where people can contact me through there. And I do I'm really focused on doing intensive counseling these days, because I just see the deep work happen in more intensive settings. And but I have a couple of different video series there. It's been kind of fun. I'm just trying to create some resources that would be helpful to people. And one is on contemplative prayer right now, which is a kind of really important. And then another one is just on the 3 questions that God asks in Genesis 3 that are like diagnostic questions for the soul to help you to begin to do the kind of work that we're talking about here. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Great. Yeah. Well, our podcast is called Hope Unabridged. And so we like to ask our guests every time as we close, where are you finding hope these days?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you for saying that. I had put something out there on Twitter the other day where I'm finding hope in pastors, right? And people were like, wow, we don't ever talk about this. I mean, we talk about all the painful scenarios, but I had just had a couple of days of several conversations with pastors who are doing some really hard work in their lives, stories, marriages, in the midst of a really hard time, probably the hardest year of pastoring that I've known in 25 years of being in this space. And so, and I was coming off a day where I was experiencing resiliency because I was seeing it in them, and I was seeing tears, but tears with smiles, that I remember one guy said, it just feels like my autonomic nervous system is, it's dialed way down from like a 10 to a 3 or a 4. And I'm much more present. And when people come to me, I listen better and I'm more curious. And he was, a tear was rolling down his face as he was saying this. Like, I can't believe I can be so calm and present. I didn't know I was capable of that. And so that gives me so much joy and so much gratification in this work, when so often the stories that get highlighted are stories that are not very hopeful, right? So thank you for asking that question.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being here. This has been an awesome conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us today on Hope Unabridged. We'd like to remind you, if you're watching us on Good Life 45, you can also listen to these episodes everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Or if you're listening and you would like to see the filmed version of this show or any of our other shows, check us out on Good Life 45 or on our YouTube channel and our app.
We hope that something you've heard today really blessed you, and we would love for you to share the show with those you love. Just hit that share button on your podcast app or on YouTube and send it to a friend. And we would also love it if you would leave us a review. With this program, we are finding hope in the unedited stories of our lives, and we want you to do the same.